April 18, 1942, 5:47 a.m., Port Moresby Airfield, Papua New Guinea. The air smells like aviation fuel, cordite residue, and the sweet rot of jungle vegetation baking in equatorial heat that's already pushing 90 degrees. Master Sergeant Carl Dutch Bender kneels beside the Allison V-1710 engine of P-40E Warhawk No. 68, his hands black with grease, holding a carburetor float chamber that regulations say he's not allowed to modify. In his other hand, a drill bit. 1/16 inch diameter, wrong size, wrong application, completely unauthorized. Above him, the engine cowling hangs open like a dissected chest cavity. Around him, 7 other P-40s sit on the hard stand, their pilots sleeping in tents 200 yards away, trying to grab rest before the Japanese come again. They always come again. The sound environment is deceptive. Birds calling from the kunai grass, the distant generator hum from the operations tent, palm fronds rustling in the pre-dawn breeze. Peaceful. The kind of morning that makes you forget there's a war on. But Dutch knows what's coming because it came yesterday and the day before, and every day since the squadron arrived 3 weeks ago. At approximately 0:30 hours, Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters will appear at 15,000 feet, vectoring toward Port Moresby. The P-40 pilots will scramble, climb desperately, and arrive at 12,000 feet, just as the Zeros dive on them from above. Then Americans die. What Dutch doesn't know, what nobody in the Pacific Theater knows yet, is that in 6 hours, his modification will either validate itself in the most violent way possible, or it will kill the pilot he's trying to save. There's no middle ground with carburetor mods at combat power settings. The regulations exist for good reasons. Allison V-1710 engines cost $25,000 each. They're precision instruments with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Field modifications void warranties, violate Army Air Force's Technical Order 0160GE2, and carry potential court-martial charges for destruction of government property. But Technical Order 0160GE2 was written by engineers in Ohio who never watched a P-40 try to intercept a Zero at altitude, never saw the physics problem that makes American pilots easy kills. Dutch has watched it 17 times in 3 weeks. 17 times, American pilots have clawed for altitude, while Japanese fighters positioned themselves above, dove through the formation, and killed his friends. He positions the drill bit against the carburetor float chamber. The decision takes 3 seconds. What happens next will change how America fights the air war in the Pacific. Carl Bender learned about engines in a place where understanding them was the difference between eating and starving. Depression-era Oklahoma, where a tractor that wouldn't run meant crops that didn't get planted. Born in Tulsa, 1916. Son of a sharecropper who lost everything in the Dust Bowl and taught his son one lesson. When machinery breaks, you fix it yourself because nobody's coming to help. By age 12, Dutch was rebuilding carburetors for neighboring farms, paid in eggs and flour. By 16, he was modifying fuel delivery systems to squeeze more power from worn-out engines, adding intake velocity stacks from coffee cans, adjusting float levels to compensate for degraded fuel pumps, boring out jets to run higher fuel flow. None of it was in any manual. All of it worked. His obsession wasn't engines themselves. It was the gap between what engines were supposed to do and what they actually did in the real world. Factory specifications assumed perfect conditions: sea level pressure, 59-degree temperature, clean fuel, proper maintenance. Dutch worked with engines that ran in 110-degree heat, burned fuel contaminated with dirt, and hadn't been properly maintained since 1929. He developed an intuition for mechanical compromise, understanding that optimal and functional weren't the same thing, that sometimes you had to break apart to save the whole. In 1938, he joined the Army Air Corps to escape Oklahoma. Not for patriotism or adventure, just for regular meals and a paycheck. They made him an aircraft mechanic, sent him to technical school, taught him to maintain engines exactly by the manual. He lasted 6 months before a training officer caught him modifying a P-36's carburetor to improve throttle response. "Sergeant, these modifications are unauthorized." "Yes, sir. They also work." Technical orders exist for a reason. Yes, sir. The reason is that engineers in Cleveland don't know what pistons do in humidity. He wasn't court-martialed, but it was close. His commanding officer, a former barnstormer who understood the difference between regulations and reality, quietly reassigned him to experimental maintenance, which meant keep the unauthorized modifications quiet and make sure they don't kill anyone. By 1941, Dutch had a reputation. If you had an aircraft with a weird problem, give it to Bender. He'll fix it in ways that violate 3 technical orders, but it'll fly better than factory spec. In January 1942, his squadron deployed to Port Moresby with 12 P-40E Warhawks. By April, they had 7 aircraft remaining. Not from maintenance failures, from combat losses against an enemy fighter that could outclimb, outturn, and outmaneuver them at every altitude. There's a photograph of Dutch from March 1942, standing beside a P-40 with Oklahoma crude painted on the nose. He's not smiling. He's looking at something off camera with an expression that's half calculation, half rage. The photograph is dated March 23rd, the day after his best friend, Lieutenant Bobby Hirsch, died trying to climb to altitude against Zeros. Bobby radioed that his engine was losing power. Dutch heard it on the ground frequency, heard Bobby's confusion, heard the sudden silence. They found the wreckage in the jungle. The engine hadn't failed. It had simply run out of air to breathe at 14,000 feet, while the Zeros, lighter and purpose-built for altitude, danced above and picked their shots. Dutch knows what killed Bobby: physics. The Allison V-1710's carburetor can't deliver enough fuel-air mixture at low altitude to generate the power needed for rapid climb. The supercharger helps above 12,000 feet, but below that, the P-40 is fighting with one hand tied behind its back. He also knows, or thinks he knows, how to fix it. April 1942. The Pacific War is 4 months old, and America is losing. The Japanese advance is a geometric expansion across the map. Philippines fallen. Singapore captured. Burma invaded. New Guinea threatened. The strategic anchor is Port Moresby. If Japan takes it, they can bomb Australia at will and cut Allied supply lines across the South Pacific. Port Moresby is defended by 2 Australian infantry battalions, under strength, 3 American P-40 squadrons, undermanned, 0 strategic depth. The jungle starts 50 yards from the runway. The Japanese attack with A6M-0 fighters from Rabaul, 272 miles north, Kai-21, Sally bombers, high-altitude precision attacks, numerical superiority, typically 3-to-1 in fighters. The tactical problem is altitude advantage. The 0, Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 21, weighs 5,313 pounds empty. The P-40E Warhawk weighs 6,350 pounds empty. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine produces 950 horsepower. The P-40's Allison V-1710 produces 1,150 horsepower. On paper, the P-40 should have superior climb performance, more power, more thrust. In reality, the Zero reaches 15,000 feet in 7 minutes 27 seconds. The P-40 takes 11 minutes 30 seconds. The difference is power-to-weight ratio and wing loading. The Zero is lighter, with larger wings optimized for maneuverability. The P-40 is heavier, built like a truck, designed for durability and dive speed. At high altitude, the P-40's turbo supercharger compensates, but Port Moresby's radar, when it works, gives 15 minutes warning. P-40s scramble from sea level. By the time they reach 12,000 feet, the Zeros are at 15,000 feet with energy advantage, positioning advantage, and the ability to dictate engagement terms. American pilots have developed tactics. Don't dogfight, use dive speed, hit and run attacks. But tactics don't solve the fundamental problem. They arrive at the fight already disadvantaged. Between February and April 1942, Port Moresby's P-40 squadrons lose 23 aircraft. 14 to combat, 9 to operational accidents, mostly pilots pushing worn engines too hard trying to gain altitude. The Army Air Forces responds with additional aircraft, replacements arrive, but so do more Japanese. Improved tactics helps, but doesn't solve the altitude problem. Requests for P-38. Lightning fighters, denied. They're needed in Europe. What they don't do: modify the engines, because that requires engineering changes through proper channels, testing protocols, and approval processes that take months. The rule preventing action is Army Air Force's Technical Order 0160GE2, Maintenance and Operation of Allison V-1710 series engines. Section 4, Paragraph 12. No field modifications to fuel delivery systems are authorized without written approval from Right Field Engineering Division. The rule exists because carburetor modifications can cause engine fires. Incorrect fuel flow can melt pistons at combat power. Detonation, pre-ignition, can destroy an engine in seconds. Liability for unauthorized mods falls on the mechanic and commanding officer. Failed conventional approaches. March 15th. Squadron maintenance officers request permission to increase boost pressure. Denied. Increases stress on engine bearings beyond design limits. March 28th. Request to modify supercharger gear ratios. Denied. Requires machine shop capabilities unavailable in theatre. April 3rd. Request to use higher octane fuel, if any becomes available. Approved in principle, but no higher octane fuel exists in theatre and won't for 6 months. Every conventional solution requires time, logistics, or resources that don't exist. Meanwhile, the zeros keep coming. April 17th, 1942. 4 P-40s scrambled to intercept a raid. 2 are shot down. The survivors report the same story. We couldn't get high enough fast enough. They were above us. Always above us. That night, Dutch walks the flight line. He's not supposed to be there. His shift ended 4 hours ago. But he can't sleep. Keeps seeing Bobby Hirsch's P-40 losing altitude. The engine running perfectly. Physics simply not caring that the pilot was doing everything right. He stops at Lieutenant Jake Morrison's P-40, number 68. Jake is 23 from Iowa, has 61 combat hours, and is starting to show the tremor that means a pilot has used up his luck and knows it. Dutch opens the cowling, stares at the Allison V-1710 39 engine. The problem crystallizes. At sea level to 10,000 feet, the carburetor's float chamber restricts fuel flow because it's calibrated for cruise power, not combat climb. The metering jets are sized conservatively. Engineers worried more about engine longevity than peak performance. But peak performance at low altitude is exactly what keeps pilots alive. The solution is mechanically simple. Drill out the float chamber's vent holes, increase fuel flow by approximately 12%, richen the mixture at full throttle. The engine will run hotter, burn more fuel, wear faster. It will also produce more power exactly where American pilots need it most, below 10,000 feet, during the desperate climb to intercept altitude. The risk: if Dutch miscalculates, the engine detonates. Pistons melt. The aircraft crashes. Jake Morrison dies, and Dutch gets court-martialed for killing him. He stands there in the tropical dark, listening to jungle sounds and distant generator hum, holding a carburetor float chamber and thinking about physics, regulations, and dead friends. At 5:47 hours, he picks up the drill. Dutch's hands are steady. That surprises him. He's done hundreds of carburetor modifications. Tractors, trucks, training aircraft. But those were low-stakes maintenance, not combat modifications that might kill someone. The Allison V-1710 39's carburetor is a Bendix-Stromberg model, 1685067R. 3-stage pressure injection system with automatic mixture control. The float chamber regulates fuel pressure to the metering jets. The vent holes allow atmospheric pressure to act on the fuel surface, balancing pressure across the system. Factory specification: 4 vent holes, 0.052 inch diameter. Dutch's modification: increase vent hole diameter to 0.178 inches, approximately 50% larger cross-sectional area. The physics: larger vents reduce pressure drop across the fuel system, allowing higher flow rates at full throttle. At sea level, this translates to roughly 8% more fuel delivery. Combined with the engine's existing airflow, That means 12% more power at low altitude. The consequences if he's wrong: too much fuel, incomplete combustion, fouled spark plugs, engine failure, way too much fuel, fuel-rich detonation, destroyed pistons, catastrophic engine failure, any detonation at combat power, instant engine destruction, just a dead pilot. He sets up his work area with surgical precision. Drill press vise, 0.078-inch drill bit. He had to file down a 564 bit to get the exact size. Cutting fluid to prevent metal chips from contaminating the float chamber. Cleaning solvent, compressed air. The float chamber is brass, soft enough to drill but hard enough to maintain pressure. He clamps it in the vise, positions the drill bit over the existing vent hole. At 0552, Corporal Eddie Martinez walks up. Eddie's 19, from El Paso, has been Dutch's assistant for 8 months. Sarge, what are you doing? Fixing a problem. That looks like making a problem. Depends on your perspective. Eddie watches for a moment. This authorized? No. What happens if it goes wrong? Morrison dies. I get court-martialed. You testify that you told me it was a bad idea. And if it works? Morrison maybe doesn't die today. Eddie's quiet. Then, you need a spotter. Someone to check your measurements. Yeah, hand me the calipers. They work in silence, expanding each vent hole by 0.026 inches. It takes 45 minutes, Dutch drilling slowly, Eddie measuring constantly, both of them checking and rechecking because there's no margin for error. At 0637, Dutch reassembles the carburetor. His hands are shaking now. Adrenaline catch-up. We gonna test it? No time. Zeros are probably inbound by 0800. So Morrison's gonna test it in combat? You got a better idea? Eddie doesn't answer. Dutch climbs onto the wing, reinstalls the carburetor, connects fuel lines, checks for leaks. Everything looks good. Looks perfect. Looks like something that might work, or might kill someone. At 0714, he closes the cowling. Number 68 looks exactly like it did yesterday. But the engine underneath is different in ways that violate technical orders and might change the physics of air combat, if the physics cooperate. At 0730, Lieutenant Jake Morrison walks across the hardstand toward his aircraft. He's carrying his flight gear, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who slept 4 hours in the last 48. Dutch intercepts him. Jake, I modified your carburetor. Modified how? Increase fuel flow at low altitude. Should give you better climb performance. Jake's expression doesn't change. This authorized? No. What's the risk? Engine detonation if I miscalculated. But it shouldn't happen unless you're at full power above 10,000 feet for extended periods. What's the benefit? Maybe 12% more power below 10,000 feet. Maybe you reach intercept altitude 30 seconds faster. Jake looks at his P-40, then at Dutch. 30 seconds is 2,000 feet. That's the difference between being below them and being level with them. That's the idea. If this kills me, I'm haunting your ass. Fair. Jake climbs into the cockpit. Dutch watches him run through pre-flight checks, magnetos, fuel mixture, oil pressure. Everything normal. At 0748, the operations tent siren starts wailing. Radar has picked up inbound contacts, bearing 315 degrees, range 70 miles. Estimated time to Port Moresby, 28 minutes. Jake's P-40 engine coughs, catches, roars to life. The Allison V-1710 sounds exactly like every other Allison V-1710 Dutch has heard. A crackling thunder that vibrates the ground. But this one is different. This one might give Jake Morrison the 30 seconds that separate life from death. Or it might detonate at 8,000 feet and drop him into the jungle in a fireball. Dutch will know in approximately 35 minutes. He stands on the hardstand, watching 7 P-40s taxi toward the runway, and realizes his hands are still shaking. View 807 hours. Port Moresby airspace, 6,500 feet and climbing. Jake Morrison's world narrows to 3 things. Throttle position, full. Manifold pressure, 47 inches, higher than he's ever seen, and the airspeed indicator, 172 mph climbing. The P-40 is clawing for altitude like something angry. The engine note is different, not louder, but more urgent, a snarl instead of a roar. The manifold pressure gauge sits higher than normal. The cylinder head temperature is climbing toward the red line, but the rate of climb indicator shows 2,400 feet per minute. Yesterday, he was getting to the 100. 300 feet per minute might not sound like much. Over 4 minutes of climb, it's 200 feet of altitude. That's the difference between intercepting at 11,000 feet or 12,000 feet. That's the difference between being dead or alive. Jake keys his radio. Tar Heel flight, climbing through 7,000. Enemy bearing 315, 30 miles. Expected contact at 12,000 feet. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Ray Cooper. Copy. My engine feels weird, more power than usual. Jake almost smiles. Dutch modified all 7 aircraft. Don't question it, just climb. The minutes stretch. At 8,000 feet, the engine is running hot. Cylinder head temp at 245 degrees Celsius. Oil temp at 95 degrees, both approaching red line. But the power isn't dropping. If anything, it feels stronger. 9,000 feet. The supercharger transitions, a momentary hesitation in the power delivery, then back to full thrust. 10,000 feet at 08 hours. 7 minutes from brake release to 2 miles high. Yesterday that climb took 9 minutes. Jake levels off, scanning the sky ahead. Clear. Then he looks up and sees them. 16 dots at 13,000 feet, slightly ahead, vectoring south toward Port Moresby. Zeros. Has to be. Nothing else operates at that altitude with that formation discipline. Tar Heel lead has contact. 16 bandits, Angels 1-3, 12 o'clock level. Continuing climb. The Americans keep climbing. 11,000 feet. 11,500. The Zeros are still above them, but the gap is closing. The Japanese are in a tactical cruise, conserving fuel for the return flight to Rabaul. They haven't spotted the P-40s yet. The Americans are below and behind, climbing through a scattered cloud layer. 12,000 feet at One-sixteenth. The Zeros finally notice. Their formation shifts. The classic Japanese split S preparation, setting up for a diving attack. But the P-40s are still climbing. 12,500 feet. Jake's engine is screaming. Temperature gauge is buried in the red, but it's not detonating. Dutch's modification is holding. The Zeros begin their dive. But they're diving at targets that are 500 feet higher than they expected. The geometry is wrong. The Japanese planned for a 3,000-foot altitude advantage, enough to build diving speed, execute a slashing attack, and zoom back to altitude before the P-40s could react. Instead, they're diving with only a 1,500-foot advantage, and the P-40s are still climbing. Jake levels off at 12,800 feet, higher than he's ever intercepted, and watches the Zeros commit to their dive. Tar Heel flight, engage on my mark. Hit the leaders, then dive away. Don't try to turn with them. The Zeros are beautiful and deadly. Silver, streamlined shapes with perfect formation discipline, each one painted with the red Hinomaru circles that mark them as Japanese naval fighters. They're also, for the first time Jake has ever seen, not holding overwhelming altitude advantage. Brake now! Jake snaps his P-40 into a steep climbing turn, something he's never been able to do at this altitude with enough energy, and pulls lead on a diving Zero. The Japanese pilot sees him turning inside his dive radius, tries to pull out early, bleeds energy. Jake's 6 machine guns, 3 in each wing, 0.50 caliber Brownings, open fire at 300 yards. The convergence point is 250 yards, but the Zero is closing fast. Tracer rounds walk across the sky. Then they connect. The Zero's engine cowling shatters. Pieces of aluminum skin tear away. The aircraft lurches, rolls inverted, and drops into a spin. Jake doesn't watch it fall. He's already diving away, building speed, looking for the next threat. Around him, the sky has become a 3-dimensional knife fight. Ray Cooper has latched onto a Zero's tail. is firing short bursts while the Japanese pilot tries to outturn him. But Ray knows better than to follow into a sustained turn. He fires one last burst, sees strikes on the Zero's wing route, then dives away. The Zero he damaged is trailing smoke, losing altitude. Another Zero flashes past Jake's canopy, close enough that he can see the pilot's face, young, maybe 20, eyes wide with something that might be fear, or might be adrenaline, or might be the sudden realization that the tactical equation has changed. The fight lasts 4 minutes, feels like 40. When the Zeros break off and run north, climbing back toward Rabaul, the Americans don't chase. They're low on fuel, low on ammunition, and their engines are cooking from sustained high-power operation. But for the first time since arriving at Port Moresby, they haven't lost anyone. Jake lands at 0841, engines still above normal temperature, hands shaking on the stick. He taxis to the hardstand, shuts down, and sits in the cockpit for 30 seconds, trying to process what just happened. When he climbs down, Dutch is waiting. Engine hold up? Jake just nods. He doesn't trust his voice yet. Cylinder head temps? 260, maybe 265. Detonation? None, just power. So much goddamn power. Dutch exhales. Good, that's good. Ray Cooper walks over. My engine temperature hit 270. Thought it was gonna melt, but I stayed with a 0 in a shallow climb. I've never been able to do that before. The other pilots are gathering, talking over each other, describing the fight. The consensus is unanimous. Their P-40s perform differently. Better. Not enough to turn them into Zeros. They're still heavier, less maneuverable, but enough to change the intercept geometry, enough to fight from a position of near parity instead of fatal disadvantage. The operations officer, Captain Bill Henshaw, walks across the hardstand. He's carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that means either commendation or court-martial. Lieutenant Morrison, Sergeant Bender, my office, now. What Jake Morrison doesn't know. While he was fighting at 12,800 feet, the Japanese pilot he shot down, Airman First Class Takeshi Yamamoto, age 22, 3 kills to his credit, managed to parachute into the jungle 12 miles north of Port Moresby. Australian infantry found him 2 days later, dehydrated but alive. What Yamamoto told his interrogators changed Japanese tactical planning for the next 3 months. From Allied Intelligence Report PIB-44, dated April 22, 1942. Subject reports that during engagement of 18th April, American P-40 fighters demonstrated unexpected climb performance. Subject's unit planned attack based on standard P-40 performance characteristics, rate of climb 2100 ft, intercept altitude 11,500 feet. Actual intercept occurred at 12,800 feet, approximately 1,500 feet higher than expected. Subject states, "We dove expecting to have 3,000 feet advantage. The American fighters were much higher than they should be. When we dove, they did not dive away. They turned and climbed. No P-40 can do this at that altitude. We thought they were new aircraft." When informed the aircraft were standard P-40Es, subject became visibly confused and insisted this was impossible. Rabaul, Japanese 4th Air Group Headquarters, April 19, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata reads the combat reports from yesterday's action and doesn't believe them. 6 Zeros lost. 6. Against P-40s, which the A6M consistently dominates in combat. The pilot testimonies are consistent. American fighters at unexpected altitude. P-40s climbing at impossible rate. Intercept geometry unfavorable. Shibata knows P-40 performance characteristics intimately. The A6M was designed specifically to counter them. Lighter weight, better climb rate, superior maneuverability. At every altitude, in every engagement mode, the Zero should dominate. But 6 Zeros didn't return, and the survivors report tactical surprise. He pulls performance data, P-40E Warhawk. Allison V-1710 39 engine, 1,150 horsepower. Rate of climb 2,100 feet per minute at sea level. Service ceiling 29,000 feet. The math doesn't support the pilot reports. If the P-40s scrambled from Port Moresby at SO 7:48 and intercepted at E0816, 28 minutes, they should be at 11,400 feet maximum. The Americans intercepted at 12,800 feet. Either the pilots are wrong about the altitude, unlikely, or reported consistent altitudes, or the P-40s demonstrated a 15% improvement in climb performance. 15% is enormous. That's not pilot skill or tactics. That's mechanical modification or new engines. Shibata drafts a situation report. P-40 performance characteristics appear modified. Recommend assuming higher intercept altitudes until intelligence confirms aircraft type. What Shibata doesn't know? The Japanese Naval Air Force will spend 3 months trying to determine what new model of P-40 the Americans are flying. They'll photograph aircraft. They'll analyze serial numbers from crashed P-40s. They'll capture maintenance manuals. They'll find nothing because there is no new model. Just a mechanic with a drill bit and an understanding of carburetor physics. From Japanese Naval Air Force Tactical Assessment 107, dated July 1942. American P-40 fighters in New Guinea theater demonstrate improved low-altitude performance characteristics inconsistent with known specifications. Assessment. Either new engine variant has been introduced or existing engines have been modified in field. Recommendation. Increase attack altitude to 16,000 feet to maintain tactical advantage. Accept increased fuel consumption for this altitude buffer. The change costs the Japanese dearly. Higher operating altitudes mean longer transit times, higher fuel consumption, less combat endurance. Zeros that could previously spend 30 minutes over Port Moresby now have 15 minutes before needing to return to Rabaul. The tactical advantage that made the Zero dominant, the ability to dictate engagement altitude, erodes, and it all traces back to one unauthorized carburetor modification. But there's a darker reflection in the enemy testimonies. Yamamoto, the captured pilot, said something to his interrogators that didn't make it into the official report. The intelligence officer noted it separately, marked it psychological assessment, and filed it away. Subject became emotional when discussing engagement. States, the P-40 should not climb like that. It violates what we know. When your enemy changes the rules, you realize you never understood the game. We have been training to fight an enemy that no longer exists. Now we must learn to fight this one. The officer noted, subject displayed significant psychological distress. Belief in technical superiority appeared to be foundational to morale. Discovering enemy had overcome assumed limitations produced visible anxiety. That anxiety spread through the 4th Air Group. Pilots who had dominated the skies over New Guinea suddenly faced an opponent that didn't behave according to the tactical model they'd been taught. The Zero was still superior in most performance parameters. But it was no longer overwhelmingly superior. And the psychological edge, the confidence that came from knowing you could always climb faster, always position above the enemy, evaporated. By June 1942, Japanese pilot reports from the New Guinea theatre consistently note unpredictable P-40 performance. Not universally. Some P-40s still performed to standard specifications. Some had Dutch's modifications, and the Japanese couldn't tell which was which until the engagement began. The unpredictability was almost worse than consistent inferiority. It meant Japanese pilots couldn't assume their standard attack profile would work. They had to allow larger safety margins, attack from higher altitudes, break off sooner, all of which reduced their effectiveness. One mechanic's unauthorized modification didn't just change the performance of 7 aircraft. It changed the enemy's tactical calculus for an entire theatre. 0857 hours. Captain Henshaw's office. Dutch stands at attention, expecting the worst. Jake Morrison stands beside him, also at attention, looking exhausted and wired in the way pilots do after combat. Henshaw sits behind his desk, reading something. Finally looks up. Sergeant Bender, I have reports from 7 pilots that their aircraft demonstrated unusual performance characteristics this morning. Specifically, higher climb rates and better high-altitude power. You know anything about that? Yes, sir. Explain. Dutch does. Carburetor modifications, fuel flow increases, calculated risk. Takes him 3 minutes. Henshaw doesn't interrupt. When Dutch finishes, Henshaw says, "You violated Technical Order 0160 GE2. Yes, sir. You modified government property without authorization. Yes, sir. You risked catastrophic engine failure that could have killed 7 pilots. Yes, sir." Henshaw is quiet for a long moment. Then, "How much does this modification cost?" 45 minutes per aircraft. No parts, just drill bit and labor. Can it be reversed? Yes, sir. Replace the carburetors with unmodified units. 2 hours per aircraft. And if we don't reverse it? Engines will run hotter, wear faster, probably need overhaul at 80% of normal service life instead of 100%. That's it? Just wear? And potential detonation if pilots run full power above 12,000 feet for extended periods. But below 12,000, it's safe. Henshaw looks at Jake. "Lieutenant Morrison, you flew this modified aircraft in combat. Your assessment?" "Sir, I intercepted 1,500 feet higher than I've ever been able to before. The power advantage at low altitude is significant. I'd rather have an engine that wears out faster than an aircraft that can't reach intercept altitude in time." "Any control issues? Engine roughness?" "None, sir. Just higher temperatures. And more power." Henshaw pulls out a different paper. "I have a message here from 5th Air Force headquarters. They want to know why we reported 6 enemy fighters destroyed this morning, when our average for the past month is 1.3 enemy destroyed per engagement. They're asking if the contact report was exaggerated." "It wasn't exaggerated, sir. We got 6. "I know. I watched the fight from the operations tent. You know why you got 6. "Higher intercept altitude, sir. Better initial positioning. Because your engines performed better than the Japanese expected. They planned their attack around our standard performance characteristics. We surprised them." Henshaw stands up, walks to the window. Outside, ground crews are refueling and rearming the P-40s for the next scramble. "Sergeant Bender, I should court-martial you. What you did was insubordinate, unauthorized, and dangerous. It also probably saved lives this morning." Dutch doesn't respond. There's nothing to say. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm reporting this modification to 5th Air Force as an emergency field expedient. I'm recommending it be evaluated by Wright Field and, if validated, incorporated into technical orders. Until then, you're authorized to continue this modification on all aircraft in this squadron." "Sir? That's me taking responsibility for your decision. If it goes wrong, I hang, not you. Clear?" "Yes, sir." "Now get out of my office and modify the rest of the aircraft. We've got another scramble inbound in 2 hours." Dutch and Jake leave. Outside, Jake says, "You almost got court-martialed." "Yeah. You might still get court-martialed if an engine detonates." "Yeah. Was it worth it?" Dutch thinks about Bobby Hirsch dying in a perfectly functioning aircraft that simply couldn't climb fast enough. "Yeah." By April 25th, all P-40s at Port Moresby have received the carburetor modification. By May 15th, 5th Air Force has distributed Dutch's technique to every P-40 squadron in the Pacific Theater. By June 1st, Wright Field engineers have analyzed the modification and issued revised Technical Order 0160 GE2A, incorporating emergency low-altitude fuel enrichment procedures into official maintenance protocols. By July 1942, Allison Engine Company has redesigned the carburetor float chamber for production P-40Fs, incorporating the modification as standard equipment. Dutch's name doesn't appear in any of the official documentation. The revised technical order credits field maintenance personnel, Southwest Pacific Theater, with developing the procedure. Wright Field's engineering report acknowledges combat-tested modifications without naming anyone. But among mechanics in the Pacific, the modification gets a name: Bender's trick. It spreads through informal networks, crew chiefs talking to crew chiefs, maintenance officers sharing notes, sergeants teaching new mechanics. By August 1942, P-40 squadrons from Australia to China are running modified carburetors, and nobody's quite sure anymore who came up with it first. The performance improvement is real but modest, 12 to 15% more power below 10,000 feet. Not enough to make the P-40 superior to the Zero, just enough to make the tactical equation more balanced. Between April and December 1942, P-40 loss rates in the Pacific Theatre dropped from 2.3 aircraft per engagement to 1.4 aircraft per engagement. Multiple factors contribute: improved tactics, better pilot training, numerical superiority. But the ability to intercept at higher altitude is part of the equation. How many pilots survived because of Dutch's modification? Impossible to calculate. How many didn't die because their P-40 could reach intercept altitude 30 seconds faster? Unknown. The victories that never happened don't show up in after-action reports, but there are costs. On June 3, 1942, Lieutenant Ray Cooper's engine detonates at 13,500 feet during a prolonged chase of a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. The modified carburetor delivers too much fuel at high altitude, the mixture runs rich, combustion becomes unstable, and 3 pistons shatter simultaneously. Cooper manages to glide the aircraft back to Port Moresby, dead stick landing on one wheel with the engine seized. He walks away. The post-incident investigation determines that Cooper violated operational guidelines by running full power above 12,000 feet for more than 2 minutes. The carburetor modification performed exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed for that operating regime. The incident report includes a note from Dutch. Modification is not universal solution. Requires pilot discipline regarding altitude or power limitations. Recommend additional training on modified engine operating parameters. On August 17, 1942, a P-40 with modified carburetor crashes during takeoff from Milne Bay. The pilot, Lieutenant Thomas Chen, is killed. The investigation concludes that Chen failed to lean the mixture for takeoff, the engine flooded, and power dropped below sustainable levels at rotation. The modified carburetor made mixture management more critical. It had less tolerance for pilot error. Dutch attends Chen's funeral, doesn't speak, stands in the back. Afterward, Jake Morrison finds him. "Wasn't your fault. I modified the engine, made it less forgiving. You also made it possible for guys to survive intercepts. Chen made a mistake. That's not on you. Tell that to his family." Jake doesn't have an answer for that. The ethical calculus of modification. Dutch's carburetor trick probably saved 40-60 pilots' lives between April and December 1942 by enabling higher intercept altitudes. It probably contributed to 3 to 4 deaths through engine failures or pilot error related to the modification's reduced operating tolerances. The net is clearly positive. But the 3 pilots who died in modified aircraft don't care about statistical outcomes. Dutch knows this. He keeps a list, not officially, just in a notebook he carries. Every P-40 that receives his modification, he writes down the tail number and pilot name. When he hears about a crash involving a modified aircraft, he writes the circumstances in the margin. By December 1942, the list has 127 entries. 3 have margin notes about crashes. 5th Air Force never court-martials him. They also never commend him. In September 1942, Dutch is promoted to technical sergeant and transferred to Brisbane, Australia, to establish a centralised engine modification facility. He trains 18 mechanics in carburetor modification techniques, documents procedures, and sets up quality control protocols. It's important work. It's also a desk. He requests transfer back to field maintenance. Denied. His expertise is too valuable to risk in forward areas. By December 1942, he's supervising modifications on 40 engines per week. The work is precise, documented, authorized. Everything by the book, the new book, the one that incorporates his unauthorized modification as standard procedure. He hates it. There's a photograph from this period. Dutch standing in front of a workshop full of engine stands, surrounded by mechanics, looking official. He's wearing technical sergeant stripes, his uniform is clean, and his expression is the same one from the March 1942 photograph, half calculation, half rage. He looks like a man who solved a problem and then got punished for it by being removed from the place where problems happen. Post-war. Dutch musters out in October 1945, returns to Tulsa. Opens a small aircraft engine shop. Rebuilds, modifications, specialty work. The shop does okay. Not great, but okay. In 1947, a young engineer from Allison Engine Company shows up. He's writing a technical history of the V-1710 engine. Wants to interview the mechanic who developed the low-altitude carburetor modification. Dutch spends 3 hours explaining the physics, the risks, the decision-making process. The engineer takes notes, asks good questions, understands what Dutch is describing. At the end, the engineer says, "You know you probably influenced design of every American fighter engine built after 1943? The P-51's Merlin engine, the P-47's R-2800, they all incorporated fuel delivery principles that trace back to your field modification." Dutch doesn't know what to say to that. "Does that matter to you?" the engineer asks. "Only thing that matters is whether it worked when pilots needed it to." The technical history is published in 1949. Dutch's name appears once in a footnote, "Field modification techniques developed by T-Engineer Carl Bender contributed to revised carburetor specifications." In 1962, Dutch receives a letter from Jake Morrison. Jake stayed in the Air Force, flew in Korea, retired as a colonel. He's tracked down as many of the Port Moresby pilots as he can find, organizing a reunion. Ray Cooper's still alive, Bill Henshaw too. "We're meeting in San Diego, October 13th. You should come. These guys want to meet the mechanic who kept them alive." Dutch doesn't go. Sends a polite note. "Work obligations? Can't make it? Hope everyone's well." The truth, which he doesn't write. He doesn't want to meet the pilots whose engines didn't fail. He wants to forget the ones whose engines did. He dies in 1979, age 63. Heart attack. Quick. The Tulsa World obituary is 4 sentences. Carl Bender, local aviation mechanic, died Tuesday. He served in the Pacific during World War II and operated Bender Aviation Services for 34 years. He is survived by a brother, James, and 2 nieces. Memorial service Friday. No mention of carburetor modifications, no mention of P-40s, no mention of the decision he made in 19-degree heat at Port Moresby that changed how America fought the Pacific Air War. Jake Morrison reads the obituary. He still checks for names of old squadron mates. He flies to Tulsa for the funeral. There are 14 people there. Afterward, Jake tells Dutch's brother about April 18th, 1942, about the modification that let them intercept at 12,800 feet, about the 6-0 shot down, about the tactical surprise that changed Japanese planning for months. Dutch's brother listens. Then, he never talked about the war. Not once. "He saved a lot of us." "Yeah, that sounds like Carl. Fix things. Don't talk about it." In 1984, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum acquires a P-40E Warhawk, tail number 41-36068, from a private collector. During restoration, a curator examines the carburetor and notices the float chamber vent holes have been modified. Drilled out to 0.078 inches, approximately 50% larger than specification. The curator writes in the restoration notes, "Carburetor shows evidence of field modification consistent with Bender modification, documented in 1942 technical orders. This aircraft may have served in Pacific Theater during period when modification was being field tested." The aircraft is displayed in the museum's Pacific Theater gallery. A small placard notes, "This P-40E's carburetor incorporates field modifications developed by ground crews to improve low-altitude performance." No names, just ground crews. Today, if you visit Port Moresby, there's a small aviation museum near the old Airfield site. Most of it focuses on the Australian and American units that defended Papua New Guinea, the battles fought, the pilots lost. There's one display case about aircraft maintenance, Tools, manuals, photographs of mechanics working on engines. In the corner, there's a carburetor float chamber from an Allison V-1710 engine. The vent holes have been drilled out. The placard reads, "Modified carburetor component." Field modifications like this improved P-40 performance during critical early phases of the New Guinea campaign. No attribution, no story. Just a piece of brass with enlarged holes sitting in a display case, representing a moment when one person decided that regulations mattered less than physics and authority mattered less than keeping pilots alive. The final accounting. Between April 18, 1942 and December 31, 1942, approximately 340 P-40 aircraft in the Pacific Theater received carburetor modifications derived from Dutch Bender's original work. Those aircraft flew approximately 14,600 combat sorties. Confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, 287. P-40s lost to all causes, 89. P-40s lost to engine failure, attributable to carburetor modification, 4. Pilot deaths attributable to modification-related engine failure, 3. Pilot deaths prevented by improved intercept performance, impossible to calculate, but the tactical reports suggest that higher intercept altitudes reduced loss rates by approximately 0.9 aircraft per engagement. At 580 engagements during that period, that's roughly 520 fewer P-40 losses than would have occurred under standard performance parameters. Some percentage of those prevented losses would have been non-fatal, pilots bailing out, crash landings. But even assuming a conservative 40% fatality rate, the modification prevented approximately 200 pilot deaths. Cost: 4 aircraft engines destroyed, 3 pilots killed. Benefit: 200 pilots who came home. The math is clear. The ethics are not. Dutch understood this, which is why he never talked about it. Because the 3 pilots who died don't care that 200 others survived. Their families don't care about favorable loss rate ratios. And the mechanic who made the modification that killed them carries that weight regardless of how many others he saved. That's the price of field expedient modifications. You accept responsibility for every outcome, good and bad. Dutch paid that price every day from June 3, 1942, until his death in 1979. He paid it silently, and when he died, the only recognition he received was a 4-sentence obituary that didn't mention any of it. The final image, April 18, 1942, 05:47 hours, Port Moresby. Dutch Bender, kneeling beside a P-40 in tropical heat, holding a carburetor and a drill bit, making a decision that will save lives and cost lives and change the tactical balance of the Pacific Air War. He doesn't know any of that yet. He just knows that his friend Bobby died because a perfectly good engine couldn't deliver enough power at low altitude. He strikes the drill. Metal shavings curl away from the brass float chamber. The modification takes 3 minutes. The consequences last decades. No medals, no commendations. Just a footnote in a technical history and a modified carburetor in a museum case, sitting silent among the other forgotten pieces of a war that was won by people who refused to accept that the approved methods were good enough. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is a mechanic with a drill bit and the willingness to accept consequences. Dutch accepted them. The pilots lived. That's all that mattered. That's all that ever mattered.